record on this computer. I don't think I uploaded the last recording. I need to do that. Anyway, hi, welcome. We're here for How to Rock the Technical Interview by Scott. Before we do that though, I just wanted to go over that by now you should be submitting your LinkedIns to the mentors you've been paired up with if you haven't already. Please do that. Even if they're not totally ready, go ahead and get those over to them so that they can be reviewing what you do have and giving you feedback so that you know where to go. If you have to put like a hard stop on like how much effort you're spending on it, at least you'll have some of it reviewed rather than never getting any of it reviewed. So do submit those no matter what state they're in. Scott is going to do a presentation today on how to rock the technical interview. This will hopefully set you up for some success next week when you're actually doing mock interviews, mock job fit and technical interviews. The next thing we're going to be doing after this is hopping into week 2, which is all about interviewing. So on Saturday, Mindy's going to be talking to us about the take-home assignment that you'll be doing. And then for your interviews, you have the job fit and the technical interview. For the job fit interview, you're paired up with a mentor. Make sure you send them your LinkedIn because it's what they're going to look at to kind of build an interview for you. So your job fit mentor, send your LinkedIn. Your technical mock interview, send the take-home assignment that you do. So each one of them will have an artifact that they will use to interview you with. We'll learn more about the take-home assignment on Saturday. You, again, as the Collabby, should reach out to your mentor to schedule things that work for both of you. What am I missing? What am I missing? Everything's in Notion. If it's not, let me know so that I can make sure it is in Notion. And I should have been more prepared than this. I think that that's it. With that, I will turn it over to Scott to tell us how we should rock the technical interview.
Cool. Well, I'm going to share my screen real quick. Oh, but I need to be enabled to do that.
Right. Permissions and things. Let's see. Share screen. All right.
Cool.
We're good to go.
All right. Let's see here. Present. Okay. So this is really exciting for me because I've changed jobs a few times in the last 3 years. I think I've actually had, I've worked at 3 different companies. And so it's been really interesting because I've gone on the job market in a really thorough way for like a multi-month job hunt each time. And so I'm really excited to share some of the insights that I've had with interviewing at like the FANG companies and smaller companies, and it's all kind of mashed into this. And so it's kind of a text-heavy presentation, but hopefully that means you can kind of go back to it and in the present moment, just let my nonsense wash over you. Right, so the agenda for how this is gonna go is first we'll talk about how companies like structure and schedule their interviews. I wasn't sure if like others are gonna talk about this, but it feels like an important point to talk about and it'll be quick anyway. The second section is gonna be about how to make a good impression in your technical interview, how to sort of set yourself up logistically for success. There's going to be another section on how to actually do the technical component, how to systematically approach the technical interview challenges. Section 4 is going to be about the behavioral interview within the technical interview. Sometimes there's some overlap. Sometimes there's sort of like a technical behavioral interview that's its own thing and like in like the last round usually, but sometimes they kind of bleed into each other and it's important to know what kinds of questions to expect. I also wanted to talk a little bit about system design because I've had a few of these. They're always really fun, but it's important to know what steps you can take to destroy one of those interviews. It's usually the kind of thing where you can set up some pretty good practice for yourself. And so I wanted to discuss the method I use to handle those. And then finally, just like how to interview the company that's interviewing you, because after all, you want to figure out if this is a good place for you, not just the other way around. So that's how this is going to go, hopefully. All right, so this is a typical interview schedule for like the full course of interviewing with a company. Again, you might have seen this or a version of it from somebody else, and you might already be familiar with it, but indulge me a little bit because it took me some time to move all the boxes around. Ordinarily, on the first day that you're talking to a company, you'll have a recruiter phone screen. They'll chat with you a little bit. Usually, if you've got a lot of detail on your LinkedIn, it won't even matter because they will ask you to recite a list of keywords functionally at them to explain like the things that you've done, how much experience you've had in them, and like what you're good at, what your key skills are. And if they like you and they get the nod from management usually, but sometimes they'll have enough autonomy to just pass you along, you'll usually have a remote technical or behavioral screen. Sometimes some smaller companies in particular like to stick a manager screen like right in there on day 2. And then usually there's another one of those before going to the cluster, which would be kind of the 4th day. It used to be something where like in tech, they would fly you out to wherever the company's headquartered, especially for larger companies. I've done that a few times. It's really fun. But these days, I think everyone's kind of on a sort of page where you want to consider the onsite to be probably virtual, which is for the best considering the plague of it all. But so usually the structure of that day will be, you'll kind of need to block off an entire day to conduct these. You'll start with a recruiter sync, whoever hopped on the phone with you, or an HR rep of some kind. They'll walk you through what the day is going to be like usually. And then there will be panel interviews sometimes one-on-ones. Usually, almost without exception, you'll meet the manager. And sometimes there's like a system design interview, but ordinarily it's about 5 or 6 hour-long meetings, some breaks in there for lunch. Again, it depends and varies widely by company what this day actually looks like, but usually it's a mix of technical panels, technical one-on-ones, and then behavioral or sort of like manager/team fit interviews. And then at the end of that, you're absolutely wiped, but ordinarily, especially at FANG companies, in between day 3 and day 4 of this process, they will send you like a prep guide. When I interviewed at Facebook a couple times, they sent me like an entire packet. It was like 40 pages long about how to interview at Facebook and like resources to review and videos to watch and stuff. So some of them have very specific prep guides, but again, that depends widely on the company. Smaller companies ordinarily won't tell you what's going on, and their day 4s can be really varied. At one of the companies I used to work for, a smaller org, the first thing we'd have them do in day 4 was like give a presentation about themselves. So like make a Google Slides deck and present like, this is me, this is my career, this is what I'm good at, here's a project I did. So, kind of be ready to expound on yourself a bit. I spent more time on this than I thought I was going to, but again, if you haven't had this experience before, then it's important to know like what to expect there. Right, so. Next section is like, so the structure in terms of like, what do they want from you? And I feel like this is an important point to drill in. It is not a test of your aptitude for the job of software engineer. A failed technical is not necessarily an indicator that you aren't good or aren't technically apt. I have failed many technical interviews because I just got something that I didn't know how to do. It's usually a test of like, how well you can solve a specific kind of problem. And there's a second sub-bullet here. Sometimes it's a recruiter scapegoat. I have had the experience of one time when I interviewed at Twitter. I passed all the interview rounds, including the technical. I know this because I know someone who works there and they have a pretty uninsulated hiring process. He mentioned to me later that I had passed all of the rounds, but there was some kind of internal political kerfuffle, but the recruiter told me I failed the technical. So sometimes they just say that stuff. Try not to get discouraged in case that happens to you. It's not a judgment of you as a person. Sometimes it's not even a judgment of you as a person who was in a technical interview. But so yeah, that's an important understanding, like what it's not. But what it is a test of is like, they need to know something about your coding aptitude. So you have to probably solve the problem to pass the round. On a panel day, they tend to be a little more forgiving because it's a lot of interviews together. If you're on like day 4, you're doing the virtual onsite, you might not solve one of the problems and you could be fine. But like they're trying to get some signal that you know how to work in whatever coding language you prefer or whichever one they use. Code reach, I've interviewed at Google and they really like to test for code reach. This is the ability to like hold stretches of code in your head and think across like a few different segments. So that's something that some companies are testing for very specifically. Communication, this is a really big one. Ask a lot of questions, code out loud. I'm going to drill into this during this presentation. You always want to be talking about what you're doing, even if it can feel silly at times. This is a really good thing to practice in the career lab. They're looking for clear code. They want your solutions to be readable and ideally descriptive variable names. As in my experience, especially writing a lot of Python and Ruby, that way to shy away from variable names like I, J, K, stuff like that. Sorry, that's my inner SoCal accent coming out. And anyway, okay, so they're kind of testing for vibe too, and this is an odd one to see in a technical interview, but like this is their one chance to kind of see what kind of teammate you might be. So you want to project, I'm a team player, I'm pleasant to work with vibes if you can. Be present and be yourself. That's the main thing. And they do expect you're going to be nervous in these. That's usually taken into account in review panels. I also wanted to mention there's kind of two normal kinds of technical interviews. One kind is like, did the candidate get the IDE to run the code and get the output that we expected? So usually these are run in something like CoderPad, which is a live coding website where you'll both be looking at the same notepad and there's like a shell next to it that'll run whatever you wrote. And in these, I think I would just want to help clear up some of the parameters. If they need you to get the thing to run and you're under time pressure, you can ask them if you can like Google some specific like library functions if you don't remember what they are. And the worst they can say is no in that case. But I run into this problem a lot, or I ran into it when I was interviewing. Like I can never remember the Python function, like the name of it for the one that's like, is it an alphanumeric thing? And that's sometimes necessary when you're looking at like palindrome reverser interview questions. So if I'm in one of these, that's something I'll ask them if I can Google. And sometimes that's fine, but usually, yeah, it's just like they want to see if you can get the code to run in their IDE. But there are other companies who really want to know like how your thought process works about it, and they might not even put it in CoderPad. And sometimes, you know, these folks will, sometimes they won't. But like at Google, they interview you in Google Docs. It's kind of interesting, and so like usually your pseudocode is kind of the most important phase of this. We'll talk about the different stages of solving a coding interview, but they really want to know like, did you figure out how to make this algorithm happen? And they've structured the challenge in a way that you don't really need to get every bit right. And so in cases like these, and these are sort of a good substitute for a whiteboard interview, you might like just write in is al num or something if you forgot what the name for like, is this an alphanumeric character is? And usually they're fine with something like that because that's not the important part to them. So yeah. That's just, I wanted to clear up, those are two different kinds I've noticed, and that's an important split. Like one is very much kind of a remote first ideology, and the other is more like emulating what it's like to do this challenge at a whiteboard where you don't have no resources, but it kind of doesn't matter. Okay, so anyway, section 2. This is just about looking your best for your interview. So number 1, make sure you've got good lighting. Don't be like in a closet if you can avoid it. Number 2, have a clean background. Don't look too much like me where there's like boxes and stuff in the way if you can avoid it again. Number 3, dress up head to toe. This one's important, especially on like the virtual on-site day, because you don't want to get up and not be wearing like pants. That's embarrassing, especially if you're on camera all day long, or if an emergency comes up during your 6 hours of interviews. You just want to make sure that you're prepared for that. Wear headphones, don't have ambient noises intruding too much. It'll also maybe help you focus as well. Again, let your family or roommates know that you're interviewing. Let anyone who's around know that you're going to be engaged in this thing that is very important you not be disturbed in. Avoid distractions. So that's like, yeah, mute or silence your phone. You know, use do not disturb mode on your computer so that you don't have notifications dinging in the top right corner. I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me. And if they give you a link to any materials like a CoderPad in advance, and a lot of these places will send you this like, you know, 1 or 2 days out, just go to the website, make sure you can get as far in as they'll let you before the interviewing actually starts. Sometimes companies will have like proprietary tools they use for this that you'll either want to make an account in or something. Just, use that time, do that, follow the instructions. Okay, so now we're going to talk about actually rocking the technical interview. So there are functionally 5 steps to this, although there's a step 0 I want to talk about as well that I've kind of noticed as well. But so basically these steps are like, number 1, get your head around the question. That's an interactive process that you're going to want to do out loud. Number 2, you're going to brainstorm ideas, also out loud. Number 3, you're going to write some pseudocode. And again, talk through this, and I'm going to go through each of these in more depth, and then write and test your solution in whatever language they want you to write it in. That's really all there is to it. But let's get into what I mean by some of these things. So in terms of understanding the interview format, this is an area where like I've had a bunch of really varied experiences. So like most companies will ask you to solve like 1 question, maybe 2 or 3 per technical interview. And so a lot of the tips in this section assume that you're going to have one of those interviews. And interviewers really want to see how you think in these, or they really want you to like solve a particular problem. But I've also interviewed at companies that send like a lightning round at you. LinkedIn does this. And so the technical challenge you'll get from them is you'll get on a call and interviewers will like usually tell you in advance, but the entire process is like, answer as many of these coding questions as you can, solve as many of them as you can. And like my interviewer, when I did this at LinkedIn, kept telling me like, stop explaining to me what you're doing and just solve the problem, because there's 19 more of these and it's about how many you can do. And the way they, like, I understand the reason why they did this. They did this because like, they understand, I think quite candidly, that you could very easily get tripped up by just getting the wrong algo question or getting some random piece of coding trivia you just don't know the answer to. And so like they just give you some outs for that. And they just give you as many as you can, but like time matters in an interview like that. So I would say, as a general rule, ask your interviewer how many questions are going to be in the interview. Again, the worst they can say is like, well, let's start with 1 and see how many we get through, which is a pretty common response. But at LinkedIn, it's very clearly like, there's 20, let's go. And so that's something that can happen to you. I also want to mention in this section that Amazon's day 4, I've done these and it varies pretty widely, but mine only had, gosh, I think I met with 7 or 8 people that day. Only one of them was a coding interview. Amazon's weird this way because their interview process, like by the time you hit day 4, it's just about stories. They have leadership principles, and I'll probably go into a little bit more detail in the behavioral section on this, but like that format, super different from everybody else's. It's worth discussing, and I have some tips on this in a later slide. But yeah, so anyway, step 1. Understand the question. Before you write anything down, I really mean it, don't write word 1, ask clarifying questions. Some companies are really specifically looking in their structured interview process for questions you're asking. Sometimes they've got like information in a clipboard, in a document somewhere that they're only going to paste into your coder pad or whatever if you ask for it. So it's important to like look at a problem and think about what information you don't have that you might need in order to solve it, and ask that, because they're testing in some ways your behavior as a programmer, like not knowing something, like not knowing what you don't know. That's what they're trying to figure out if you are aware of. So ask them, for example, input and output. Sometimes they give you some anyway, but another really good trick here is to suggest your own input and then ask them, okay, so if the input is 1, then the output should be true, right? That's, just as an example. So ask about edge cases. That's an important one. So like, you might be given, for example, like a question that deals with an array. Maybe ask about what happens if you get an empty array. How should the solution respond in that case? And along those lines, ask about how you might respond to error handling. Sometimes in this case, you might not think of it like immediately, but as for an example, you might get a question about a palindrome, detecting whether something's a palindrome. And again, like maybe ask what you should do if you get how do you handle numbers? How do you handle input that is like, is 112211? Is that a palindrome? Does that count? How about something with symbols in it? How about something with only symbols in it? What if we're past something that isn't a string? Like, what kind of error should we handle? Or should we raise? Should we just like bail? These are important things to ask your interviewer, because they can then tell that you're kind of thinking diagnostically and about like how this function that you're writing might fit into a broader program. So let's look at an example question. The question is, given a list of numbers and a target number k, return whether any two numbers in your list add up to k. Fair enough, right? So some good follow-up questions we can ask is like, can the same number be repeated in that list of numbers? So like in 1, 5, and 2, k equals 4, right? So like in that particular example, can we add 2 to itself? Okay, that's a good one to think about. You can ask, will the input be sorted? That's a really good one, and that's important to think about, like sorting and input in particular. Is there anything you will need to do to sanitize the input? And if so, like, is there, can you make an assumption about that already happening? Is space or running time more important? This is an area we're going to talk about. You will get probably at least one Big O trivia question per technical interview. And I would argue it's not super important, but it is important only in as much as you should be able to make some kind of Big O analysis. It doesn't have to be great, but as long as they know that you kind of know how to speak that language, usually that's enough for most employers. And again, what should be the output is a good follow-up question. So like, should it be true or false? Should it be the numbers that add up? Should it maybe be like a map rather than just like a Boolean? Maybe the indices. So that's a good question if they don't already specify what the output should look like. Okay, so next thing you should do after you get all of those questions answered is brainstorm some ideas. And again, maybe don't be writing any code at this point. When you're brainstorming, you might be writing, but like I would suggest not even writing anything down yet at all. Just except maybe for clarifying stuff in comments. But so yeah, the first thing, and this is a really important one, an inefficient solution is still a solution. So I would always say, especially if you have time, start with a brute force answer that solves the problem in some kind of a way. I can promise this is better than an incomplete version of it, where you've got the sort of grand design at the end of the thing that's always like super, elegant, and you've got it all put together. Like if you have one working solution, then that's a bird in the hand. So I would say take that. Always think about trade-offs between space and runtime. So again, a nice thing to think out loud when you're talking is like, well, we could do it this way with recursion maybe, and that's going to take up more space. But like, it'll technically be faster. And if we do it this other way, it's a nested loop, and that's going to take more runtime. So like I said earlier, you might be asked about Big O, so be ready to discuss it. I have some good resources for looking at Big O if that's not something that you've had the opportunity to look at before. Another thing is, so think through different data structures, evaluate which ones might be a good fit for the problem. Again, I've known interviews, especially for entry-level software engineering jobs, to just be evaluating, especially for like the first technical interview, like did you choose to use a dictionary or like a map rather than like nested arrays to solve something. Just being aware of different data structures, maybe even talking through out loud which ones you're considering for different reasons. And I want to stress again, think out loud. This is a really important thing to do in the brainstorming phase. And I would say this mostly because it shows them how your thought process works, but also because if you are in a particular line of reasoning that they think might lead you down a bad path, a lot of interviewers wanting to see you succeed and also knowing that you might have like good ideas will sort of like nudge you in one of two directions you might be going down. Many interviewers are friendly and helpful that way. It shouldn't be adversarial. If it is, I might not recommend working at that place. But I would say, this is a really good reason to be thinking out loud, is because occasionally they'll give you some help. And I would say in many cases, like I don't deduct points for someone like getting help from me as an interviewer. I've always viewed it as more collaborative than that. But anyway. Step 3 is, I would say, in like a multi-line comment or something, write some pseudocode. So write some Python, basically. But yeah, after discussing possible solutions and deciding on one, sometimes with their help, I would write pseudocode that sort of goes through like, for X and Y, and it sort of like talks about what your code should do. This is useful as an artifact for them because, again, even if you don't get to a complete solution, then they've got pseudocode that sort of, it makes the case, especially like if you're marginal on some other things, like that you know what you're doing and you know how to solve the problem algorithmically. And then you actually write your solution in code. So remember to talk while you're coding, say everything you're doing. You can, and I think we're gonna go through some examples of how to do this, not in this, but we'll definitely, while we're mocking interviews, while I'm interviewing, I'm interviewing Megan, I can't remember, but we'll get there and we'll show you exactly how to do this. But you might, for example, say like, okay, so now I'm going to write a loop. We'll be declaring this variable for the loop variable, initializing it at 0, and we want to stop the loop at this value, the length of the string or whatever. These are just good things to narrate so they know that you understand how your own solution works. And they also want to see you make decisions about trade-offs, about how to handle the problem. And they want to understand what your train of thought is like. So again, I can't stress enough, be communicating. That's absolutely critical. So we're looking at the example question, which again was given a list of numbers and a target number k, return whether any two numbers in your list add up to k. Now, this is going to be the part where I just look kind of dumb because I genuinely don't know how to read JavaScript. I mean, I do, it's just Java, but different. So here we have a function taking the argument nums and target, nums.sort. Okay, so this one assumes non-sorted input. And then, okay, so yeah. Anyway, I think the main point of this slide, I'm not going to try and read the JavaScript because that's a part that I'm just not as familiar with, but you can go back and take a look at sort of different ways to solve the problem. What I wanted to, I think the point this slide is intended to make, though I didn't write this particular one, is that it's possible to come up with several different solutions to a problem. And as you can see, one of these uses a while loop, one of them uses a for loop. One of them declares variables outside the loop. Looks like the other one is just using contextual variables. And one of them is flagging with scene as a way to kind of determine what we've already seen inside of the array we're checking out. So like there's multiple ways of solving the problems. And I think that's kind of the point being transmitted here. The last piece here that I want to mention is test your solution and iterate on it if possible. So using the examples that you were provided at the beginning and ones you've created and validated with the interviewer, test your code. You can run it in the IDE if possible, but if you don't have that option available to you, you can test it kind of manually, and we're going to talk about that in a second here. Come up with new test cases if you need to, and think of some errors that you might have made. There's common errors that you can just check for pretty trivially, like did you maybe miss any less than, greater than, less than eq, greater than eq, and this is especially true with like while loops. Look out for the fence post problem, look out for off by one errors, look out for type issues. I have this a lot, but maybe that's just because I work in Python, which is like duck typed, and so things get inferred really easily and moved around a lot. So yeah, that's a problem I have, but check your types and then just look for ways to test, and as you're kind of running through line by line, seeing what your code does. And I also recommend that practice pretty thoroughly, is like maybe take it, especially if you don't have an IDE, but even if you do, go through your code line by line, take an input variable and just say out loud what is happening in every line of your solution. Especially if you are not entirely sure of its correctness, especially if there's a problem that they've pointed out to you. That's what I would do, and that frequently leads you to understand what's going on. If you do have an IDE where you can run stuff, print debug, add printf statements or whatever it is in JavaScript, puts, or I honestly log console something. I don't know how your language works, but that's what I would do. Log things that you need to track and keep track of what's going on there. Inside of a loop, check out the values in there. That's absolutely critical if you run into problems. And then comments, this is a really good a chance to show that you know how to document code. as well as you can sort of use this to walk yourself through line by line exactly what's going on in a particular run. So there's also this idea of kind of using a table to show input and all of the relevant variables and output. And so this is similarly to this kind of methodology where you can see here like the state of different variables that are used by this particular solution. And keeping track of those. You can also use a truth table if there's Booleans involved. These are pretty common methodologies, but just the basic principle I think remains here, which is just like be aware of state. State is a really important concept in this case. I would say like the state of each of these variables at each iteration of any loop, and given various possible inputs, being able to talk through how that goes is important, and it's a good thing to practice. That's one of the most important things to practice, is writing code that you can explain what it's doing at each step. And run your code. Again, this is only an option if they give you a place to run it, but run it and use the built-in error checking that exists as a function of just the standard library of JS or React or whatever framework is providing your code. If you have something to run it in, errors can be really helpful. Read them. That's certainly not cheating. Okay, so that's the basic framework for the technical interview. I also wanted to mention like that every technical interview is also a behavioral interview in a way. You're being evaluated on how you respond to problems under pressure. So be curious, be open, ask lots of questions, and talk a lot. And I didn't finish that line, so I'm going to fix that later. Actually, I can just strike it. It's not that important, but like that's the main point. Be curious, be open, ask lots of questions. I just mentioned down here that I'm sure I got the is alnum method wrong even here, but yeah, so I have asked that in interviews where that's allowed, where you're not running in a whiteboarding mode. Again, that's occasionally something you can do. If you're stuck on something, you can talk to your interviewer. They're a real person, and they want to get through this with you. And I also don't want it to be painful for everybody involved. So, they're a human being, and you can speak to them. That's okay. And I think it shows good general behavioral mettle as well. So there's also behavioral interview tips that are separate from this. So number one, it's a really good idea to prepare scenarios of conflicts or difficult situations you've dealt with. I have a list of some of these behavioral questions that I've seen on the next slide. Don't be surprised if in a technical interview, the first, 10 minutes or something might be behavioral questions that are just straight up like, tell me about a time when questions. So we'll go into those in 1 second. When you're answering one of those questions, you're going to want to use the STAR method. So that's situation, which is describe sort of the context of what was going on. I was a junior software engineer working at Cisco, and I was working on a piece of code where it had to do with our test bed. It was written in Ruby. I was really new to Ruby, and I didn't know how to solve a particular kind of problem. Task, I was tasked with the maybe having to figure out how to integrate something with something else. So you talk about what context you were in, maybe what knowledge you had, or what other people were involved. Task is what you had to do. Action is what you did, and result is how things changed as a result. It's pretty simple. You would honestly be stunned how many candidates could really benefit from learning the STAR method, because they don't understand how to describe their experiences like succinctly and systematically. How were things? What did you have to do? What did you do? What happened as a result? And you can also add what you would do better today. Sometimes they'll ask you that as a separate question. And so that's important to notice. I would recommend you take a look at Amazon leadership principle questions. There's a link in the slideshow, and I'd recommend you check it out. That's just links to levels.fyi has a list of some of the leadership principle questions. Did I talk about that? Okay, yeah. So behavioral interview questions tend to go something like this. They might go like troubleshoot something for me, like maybe pretend I'm the debugging console, and they'll like spit some error out at you, and you have to kind of walk through what that was like. They might ask you to explain something to them, like a concept or a particular piece of technology. They might ask you to explain like they're 5. They might ask you to explain like they're a junior engineer. They might ask you to explain like they don't know anything about technology. These are tests of your ability to sort of summarize concepts, but also to like to very quickly condense your knowledge. And it's sort of a proof of knowledge token. And I don't love these because they're kind of trivia questions, but they'll happen to you certainly. And then these are really key. Tell me about a time when you ... And so these are all real ones I've seen. Tell me about a time when you solved a difficult problem and how did you do it? Tell me about a time when you had a conflict with a colleague, how'd you resolve it? Tell me about a time when you had 2 urgent competing priorities, 2 things that were both really important and both really urgent. How'd you pick which one to do, or how'd you manage to do both, or who'd you talk to make it all happen? Tell me about a time when you had to learn something new or teach yourself something new, more about the context and how you learned it. Tell me about a time when you failed at something. These are questions that like, I would prepare something for every single one of these if you don't have something off the top of your head. And I'd have like a star response ready for at least all of those, personally, before going into an interview process. I'm sorry, and here's just like a reminder of stars. So like maybe, again, tell me about a time when you had a conflict with a colleague. You want to talk about what the conflict was, maybe your position and your colleague's position. Were they like a manager? Or was it like a coworker, someone on a different team? Talk about like why it was important, what happened, talk about what you did in order to resolve the conflict, and then talk about how things moved forward from there. Maybe how you determine not to run into similar conflicts in the future, just as an example. Again, just because I've interviewed everywhere, I've done this a few different places. An example question is something like, they sit you in a room, you've got 45 to 60 minutes, how would you design Twitter? Or a site that competes with Twitter? And there's no way to answer that question in 45 to 60 minutes. But what they will do is have you like, first of all, the right way to tackle this is systematically. It's a question designed to figure out how you can sort of take a giant problem and make it bite-sized. And it's also designed to show your strengths because it'll be a complex problem designed to test your general technical knowledge. And so for something like this, you know, any of you who have really significant JS, React, Node experience might focus on the front end a little bit more. For me, working in infrastructure, I have a tendency to focus on like the back end for something like this. So I might talk a lot about, networking. I can talk a lot about how to scale it, what kind of infrastructure you might build it on, capacity planning, stuff like that. But so the first thing to do is always scope the problem. Ask questions. That's the main theme I want you to take away from today is you should be asking a lot of questions. So for something like Twitter, what features does it need to support? Does it need to be able to, so you got to show a timeline, right? Do you need to be able to post things? Certainly. Do you need to be able to post media? Do you need to be able to like do link shortening? What kind of stuff does this have to do? And you can then sort of narrow down, like usually they will have constraints for you that are specific to that system design question, like, and then all of a sudden, like it gets a lot more sort of chompable. Like I said, play to your strengths. You don't know how to design everything for something like this, but focus on the parts you know really well. If you know how to like manage the UI end of this, then like maybe you're talking about user requirements, maybe you're talking about accessibility. These are things that you can very easily distinguish yourself by focusing on and then having knowledgeable follow-up questions and answers about like what you might do. Brainstorm and design out loud. This is exactly the same as a regular technical talk about what you might do, talk about, given the constraints that you've figured out in step 1, maybe this thing needs to run properly in the US. Maybe you don't really care too much about other time zones, but maybe there's a GDPR constraint. What if there's localization you have to worry about? So then you start thinking to yourself about like, okay, so what do we need in order to support this? And so just be designing out loud, let them know what you're thinking about and what's important to you. That's one of the key things here. Consider new and different technologies for sure. And show them that you have wide experience here as well as deep stuff. And then basically come up with a basic abstract design first and then refine it later. For something like Twitter, maybe what you're thinking is like, right, so this is going to be basically a SQL database, and a tweet or whatever it is in our prototype is going to be a row, and it'll have like a sender, it'll have some kind of content that fits in like a nice 140 character string field, and it's going to have a date when it was posted, and then you can sort of like go through from there. And you don't have to get all the way to how Twitter operates today, which is like memcache databases geo-synced across multiple continents. But if you can come up with the version that's really simple that like makes sense, that's a good thing to have at first, and then you can expand it. And usually this will be a good place for the interviewer to prompt you, and it's more of a conversation. So that's my methodology. First, figure out the constraints in the scope. Second, make sure you're playing to your strengths and ask questions about things that you know how to follow up on, and propose things that you know a lot about. Number three, do a lot of thinking out loud so they know what your thought process is. Number four, start small and simple and then make it refined and grand as you go on with the interviewer's help. And okay, so the last thing, you're interviewing the company as well as they're interviewing you. So these are happening at the same time, and usually you're only going to have a short amount of time in any given interview to do sort of questions for the interviewer. That's true in most technical interviews. You'll usually have maybe 5 minutes at the end. Sometimes the person will be able to go over, but they're often time constrained. So you might only have a few questions. If you're going to be doing a few interviews, then I might pick a few things that seem relevant to the person. If they're on the team that you're applying for, that's a really good person to ask, like, maybe what are your hours? Maybe what's an interesting problem you've solved? Or maybe what's like a fire you've had to put out in the last month that you're allowed to talk about. If it's a manager, then maybe it's a good thing for like, are there regular one-on-ones? What's something, I think these are important things to just direct, I guess is my question. But these are all really good questions that I would have a list, I'd have it written down. And I would also say that back when we were doing in-person interviews, it was really key to be writing while you were doing this. I still think it's important to write these answers down physically while the person is giving you their answer, or at least take some notes, jot some stuff down. It's a good way to signal that you're paying attention, but just have these written in a notebook or something. I feel like that's a good way to show them that you've got the questions and that you have a space for the answers, that you actually care what they are. So I also have a list of some more resources. In terms of practice for the actual technical, there's sites like Geeks for Geeks is free. There's LeetCode, there's HackerRank. There's a handful of others. And if you look up like coding interview practice on Google, you'll find even more. And as far as like a major resource, I would absolutely unconditionally recommend Cracking the Coding Interview. It's a book that I have bought 3 times because I keep saying like, I'm never going to leave this job, and then I give my copy away and I have to buy another one. It's this thick, it's bright green, and it's really, really good. It's chock full of really useful information. It's got a primer about Big O and how to answer Big O questions. It talks about data structures. It talks about the algo questions you usually get. It's got a workbook with questions and solutions in different kinds of languages. And it has a few pages about like insight that I didn't personally go into here because we really didn't have enough time with all of my meandering about like what these different FANG companies expect specifically from you. It's about like how Apple's interview process differs from Facebook's versus Google's. That's really handy, and I can't recommend that book highly enough. Get a used copy. I'll send you mine. I'm sure I won't need it ever again because I'm set at this job. It's going to be fine. But so these are all really good resources. Check out the slides after we get done with this. And I'd highly recommend Cracking the Coding. You can't recommend it enough, really. And I think that's it.
That
Alrighty.
was amazing and so much information. It's like, I was posting this in the chat, but technical interviews are so scary because like you're saying, they could be anything. They could literally be anything. So I'm wildly intimidated by them. But like the high level advice here to really think out loud and lean on what you know is really sound advice. So thank you for that. Does anybody have questions, comments, concerns, stories, more advice?
Having worked at a FANG, I can also say, like, Apple, as an example, doesn't have one interviewing experience. It's going to vary widely from group to group. So, you know, Scott, like, it's great to hear like all the different things you've experienced from interviewing at this different, all these different places. You know, you could go into a different group at Amazon or something and have a totally different experience potentially. So, yeah, it is probably the hardest thing about technical interviewing is there's no standard way that it goes. But.
For two, that's really good English. For two, also is what I meant to say. It's really good advice to like have stories in your pocket. Like Scott was saying, like go now back through your work history and think, what is just like a relevant story to tell, like about a technical experience you had, some problem that you solved technically, or for job fit interviews, when was a time that even in Career Lab, when maybe you and your teammates needed to prioritize something, or you maybe had a little bit of conflict. I think most people have pretty good experience at Collab Lab, but maybe a time you had a little bit of a disagreement and how you solved it. And of course, in any previous jobs you had, because those are things that you will get asked about at some point. So have stories, because once you have those stories and you've repeated them to yourself a few times, you can kind of pull on them to answer a lot of different questions. And hopefully you won't be in a 50-round interview at a paying company where somebody's monitoring whether or not you've told that story before. Any other questions? Are you nervous about technical interviews? Because I am very nervous about them.
I've never stopped being nervous.
Yeah, it's one of those constants. Some of you have been through some technical interviews. Like, what were those experiences like for you? I think some of you have, right? Andrew, I know you have. Anything you'd want to share?
The one that I did was very, it was for an apprenticeship, so it wasn't like horribly big O or anything. I think they weren't even expecting that you would necessarily know how to code. They were just like, learn JavaScript right now and solve this problem by Googling. But it was like, the technical side of it is probably easier than the speed dating style, like 50 different people interviewed.
That's great. I have a question. If you are allowed to Google, because I've heard a lot of interviewers be like, I want to see them go to like MDN or whatever. What do you want to see somebody Google? How do you want to see somebody Google? Is there tips on like how to Google?
This is a really interesting question, actually. Okay, so I'm sorry. I feel like I'm name dropping when I talk about places I've interviewed, although I don't work at any of them now, so like it doesn't really matter. But okay, so Splunk has a really interesting interview process, and this is just for their site reliability engineering department. But one of the things they had to do is like they built this entire like fake Kubernetes cluster for you that you have to like figure out what's wrong with it. And they've given you a debugging tool that you're certain never to have used before. And they don't usually let you take control of their screen. Instead, they tell you, they ask you what to do, and then you have to like guide them through as though you're phone support. And one of those things is like, they tested me on how to Google something, and I kept feeling like they were messing with me the entire time, or like it was a trap. But it's like, I don't know how to do this. And they're like, oh, so where would you go? And I was like, I would Google this. And they were like, okay, so what would you Google? And and I think in terms of like the best ways to do this, there's follow the console. That's a really clear one. Like maybe look very specifically at like what kinds of errors you're getting. And just think clearly through like, how much information do you actually have and what can you like actually get from it? And then like get as far as you can in your brain before you like can go to Google with like how to do X. And I feel like that's the best way you can demonstrate that you're thinking all the way through something. As for example, like I recently had to do some work where I do a lot of shell scripting because I've made some god very angry, but I had to do a conversion between Unix epoch time, which we've all had some fun working with in Firebase, and just regular kind of formatted for humanized time. And so I think, rather than like Googling the answer to the specific problem I was having, which is like how to find the difference between two, or like how to find whether some time I have is more or less than a week old. What I did instead was like look up how to convert time between Unix epoch and like human readable in Bash. And then you have to reason to yourself like, okay, if you could do that, if you can get the Unix epoch time for both of these regular human readable ones, you could just like do subtraction on it. And so like, things like that it's important to just kind of like go as far as you can, rather than like Googling at the first sign of distress. I think it is a way people are evaluating.
I love that you said like read the error messages, because let me tell you, it is just now in my career that I have started reading error messages. And it's very important, and they tell you a lot of stuff in them. There's a lot of detail in them, but like I would be like given a wall of text in my terminal and I just like blank. I'm like, this is garbage, I can't read this. But if you actually like take the time to read through it, you're like, oh, it's telling me a lot of really good stuff in here. So do that for sure. And like, I think if you do get an error, like try just like really going line by line and reading through it and kind of talking out loud about what you're seeing. Yeah, maybe even exactly where the problem is. It's exactly right. And then another thing too is if you have time and you want to learn something new that could help you with front end technical interviewing, I think it's a good idea to take a course on debugging in your browser. This is something that last time when Indieta was being technically mock interviewed at Collab Lab, that I saw her do that, I was like, dang, she is crushing it, and only because of her debugging skills. Because she was asked to implement a new feature on the take-home assignment that you all did, and she was getting error after error, and she would just like pull open her browser, console and debugger and stuff, and she wasn't like console logging stuff, which is what I think most of us would all lean into, which is totally fine, especially as a junior developer. But because she could put breakpoints in there and sort of step through the code and see what the values of different variables and stuff were along the way, it was a really, like, if I saw a junior developer do that, I'd be like, damn, like you're not a junior developer. So it's like something that is achievable that you can go learn right now. Because if I'm like, go learn everything about Next.js, it's like, no, that's not possible. But if I'm like, go learn the basics of debugging, that is achievable for all of you to do with no other experience. So yes, stepping through code and the debugger is a superpower. Spend a little bit of time just getting more familiar with the dev tools in your browser, because I promise you it will pay off. End of rant. Other questions?
Slash rant.
Slash rant.
I just have a quick question. First of all, thanks, Scott. That was super insightful. That was a lot of information. Thank you. Is there anything like you as an interviewer that you noticed from the person that you were interviewing, or any person that you're interviewing, that like really stuck out to you as being like super positive and was like, I want to get this guy at my company, or girl?
That's a great question. I think I mentioned this a little bit in the presentation. Part of it is honestly just like be open, be curious, like be yourself, have a really positive attitude. And you're going to be nervous. It's a nerve-wracking process, but if you can manage to be open and curious in the course of it, and try and embody those, that's a big differentiator. At the end of the day, structured interviewing tends to revolve around like how well you solve the problem, but there's also a number of other things that people are looking. It's like many times the interview forms will include stuff like, how good of a culture fit are they? And so like, in many cases, it's really just about like projecting that you'd be a good teammate, really treating the interviewer like they're a human being, like they're already a colleague without being presumptuous about it, can be super helpful, like treating them how you would treat any colleague. That's a good way to show that you are, mature as a coworker, and that you would be a good software developer to work with. I would say I'd really emphasize that.
I like the debugging was one for me, but also another thing is like, and I haven't given anybody a real technical interview IRL, but I've watched like several of the mock ones. And whenever I'm watching the mock ones, something that really stands out to me is be really intentional about saying everything you're doing out loud all the time. Because I found that some interviewers get really nervous with the silence. And so they start kind of trying to fill it, or it just gets really awkward. So if you can just sort of like talk through it and kind of let them know what you're thinking, it fills the space and can kind of lead you, as you know, with pairing and Collab Lab, just talking out loud can lead you to the answers sometimes that if you're in your head, you're getting nervous and you're sort of like getting twisted and can't find your place. So just say things out loud, just say it out loud. It's comfortable and I feel like they're expecting you to do it.
You want to, I've one other thing, Sam, about the like things that kind of stand out. And I guess it's similar to what Scott already said, but it really is like, you know, like I've interviewed people who I've had like kind of both extremes where people I'm interviewing, they, you know, there was a while there where I was interviewing a ton of front end developers, and I had a question where I could kind of ramp up the complexity, and I could ramp it up to the point where I think maybe one person out of maybe 200 people that I interviewed was able to handle all the complexity. So everyone, like most people would find, like I would get to a point where they didn't know how to do the next harder thing. And people, there's a range of responses, but I had people who literally got angry at me on the interview or like, when would you ever do this? And I'm like, it's a feature of the language. Like, just, you know, like part of it is kind of like finding out how do you react when you're in a situation where there's something you don't know how to do. And I had other people who are like, oh wow, I had no idea, like super excited to learn that thing, like in the moment, being, you know, kind of like being a little bit vulnerable, but like saying like, oh, I don't know that, but I'm super, like, how does it work? You know, kind of being like that curious side. So I don't know that I would interview people that way now. Like it's a little bit, I don't know. I'd have to think through whether I still agree with that approach. But you know, definitely if you find yourself in that situation, erring on the side, like it's really like growth mindset, right? Like that's kind of the thing that's being tested there, where it's like, oh, I don't know the thing, but I'm capable of knowing the thing and I want to know the thing, you know, like having that kind of attitude and approach, especially when you're early in your career, that's going to give a hiring manager confidence that, you know, because you will run into situations where you don't know how to do things, but you'll, you know, kind of dig in and learn it.
I love that. That's exactly right. Other
Awesome.
questions?
Thank you.
That was a good one, Sam.
In terms of stuff not to do, I feel like there are some other ones I didn't really cover here. And like I'm sure those of us who have interviewed have like interviewing horror stories of all kinds, but like there's a couple of things I wanted to signpost I didn't stick in the presentation. One of those was just like, if there's a specific language or framework that's in the job description, you should reasonably be expected to be interviewed technically on it. I've had a number of people we hired for Ruby or Python, and so we have interview questions written in Ruby and Python, and that's it. And someone showed up saying, I don't know either of those languages, but I want to do the interview anyway. And that was very interesting because I had him basically do the whole interview in pseudocode. Ultimately, I kind of gave him a soft yes, but I didn't really like the vibe. I felt like that was there was kind of no way that he was going to get past additional technical interviews, and so I probably should have given him a no on that day. I'm just a softie is my problem. Actually, the problem is that I'm a Libra, but I never want to make anyone mad. Anyway, yeah. So it's important, I guess, to always like read the assignment and understand the assignment, which can be on the JD. That's a pretty crucial one.
I do want to kind of point out, like a lot of the kind of like fit and vibe questions are a place where a lot of bias gets introduced into the process. So it's very natural for us to want to work with people that we vibe well with. A good hiring manager is going to be looking for people who are adding to whatever the current culture is and not just fitting in with the current culture, because then, you know, you get this kind of monoculture or something. So if you get the impression that they're leaning maybe too hard on that stuff, it could be like a bad sign about the company. It's you know, but it's kind of tricky to tell like where they're going with it. But like Amazon having like it seems out like I think it was Amazon, right? Like had to like massive like fit all these all that kind of stuff. Like they're trying to create a certain culture by bringing in people who are already aligned with it, which kind of makes sense, but I don't know. There's a kind of a philosophical debate to be had there about approach, I guess.
And I want to point out with that too, that Andrew is very mindful of these things. Probably most of the people you'll be interviewing with are not, unfortunately. So let's get out there and let's change the tech industry. Let's become the interviewers. Let's become the ones who drive these hiring processes so that we can be mindful and try and reduce biases or intentionally bias.
So you're going to get questions that are preposterous. You're going to get bad questions. They exist all over the place. And again, I would say, like, if that question turns out to be critical to the process, it might not be a good fit. A job I was offered at Facebook, one of the interview questions was entirely ridiculous. It was just like, they gave me a bash command that was relatively complex on the whiteboard. And they asked me, they were like, you have 45 minutes to explain everything that happens in Unix when you run this command. And trivia questions are among these that are just like, especially if that's the only thing you get. You can get an unfair question, and the important thing in a situation like that, because it's gonna happen if you interview enough, is just like, I would say try and remain, calm and keep an open mind. Keep an optimistic mindset and just, try and work the problem.
Yes.
And even if it's a bad problem, even if it's just like scoped wrong, do your best. And I think for the most part, there are places that are just kind of, I don't know, that are rough that you that you might not want to end up working at anyway, where that's not going to end too well. But all you can do is work the problem at the end of the day.
I think a lot of what we've talked about today is a certain type of company, and those interviews tend to be maybe a little more intense. And there are lots of other companies that are maybe less, that think less highly of themselves, maybe is one way to say it, where you might have a more kind of comfortable interviewing experience. So don't be like too turned off by like, oh, this sounds really hard. Like there's no way I can do this, because I have complete faith that all of you are capable of doing this. It's just, got to find the right company, the right fit for you.
And the pair programming experience that you've gotten at Collab Lab should set you up really well for being in this kind of environment where you're working through a problem. So when you do go into it, don't think of it as like, I'm being tested. Put it in your mind that you're working through a problem with a friend rather than somebody who's like grading you or something, and try and make yourself more comfortable like that. And I say this every time I talk about interviews, but have a handful of lines in your pocket that you can pull to kind of reset yourself. So when you start getting overwhelmed, have a line memorized. Or like, one thing I'll do, this comes from like a long time of working with clients, is if I start to get overwhelmed or confused or frustrated or something, I'm like, oh, give me just 1 second. I want to take down a note, and have like a pen and a paper where you can like, just like write things down, or just kind of get your mind right, even if it's just like scribbling and taking your mind off the screen for a second. Or like have, a line about like, give me just a second to think about that. And again, like if you have a pen and paper, you can kind of take your focus away from the screen and reset yourself. Or, like I was saying the other day, learn how to humbly say you don't know something, because you're not going to know something in an interview. And if you have a line memorized about how to express that, in a comfortable way, you'll feel better than like stumbling over and saying things like, for two, I also like that. Don't stumble over your words. It's hard to not.
It's a great point. Have some things you can do to just like reset the cadence in your head. That's invaluable. And Andrew's 100% right, by the way. And I just wanted to like redouble on that. I know I've been talking a lot about FANG today. I've interviewed at all of them except Netflix, who won't talk to me. But these are certain ways of operating an interviewing process. They're highly structured. They're really, and a lot of companies pattern themselves after FANG, but not all of them. There's a lot of great companies that don't do anything like this, that are like super, I don't know, they're great companies. I've worked at them. I've worked at small orgs, and old orgs and new orgs, and a lot of them have like maybe 1 or 2 technical rounds, and then mostly it's behavioral stuff. It's not like an entire panel of just like hitting you with as much as you can handle. It varies so widely by company. That's an important thing to note. And that I think in many ways, you'd be very well served by not working at a FANG company. There's a good reason why after having gotten offers at 2 of them, I decided not to do either. So there's something to be said for places that are a little bit outside of that particular bubble. So I also have full faith, having seen all of your work, that you're going to do amazing in this process. If you choose to go after FANG jobs, I'm sure you'll do great at those too. And I kind of wanted to give you that exposure to that stuff because I've had it. You should have it too. But yeah, you're all going to do awesome. I'm really looking forward to seeing how you do in the mocks. And thank you all so much to listening to me rant and babble for so long.
This was beautiful.
Scott,
Thank you so
yeah.
much, Scott. This was great. It's being recorded, so you can go back if you want. You know, go back through, start prepping for your mock interviews, and we'll talk more about the technical take-home assignment on Saturday. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, you just want to talk about anything, we're here for you in Slack. Let us know how we can help you, and we will see you soon. Okay. All right.
Thank
Bye,
you.
friends.
Thanks, everybody.
See ya.